Girl was crying, "Daddy, Daddy." When I woke up, the whole house was in smoke.
Corsicana, Texas, 1991. Three little girls die in a fire. Their father, Cameron Todd Willingham, survives. He cries, he screams, he begs for help. But shortly after, that same man will be accused of having started the fire that killed his daughters. He will be tried, convicted, and executed for it. And then the questions will begin. Questions that still echo 2 decades later. Was he truly guilty? Or did Texas execute an innocent man based on outdated science, social prejudice, and a need to close a painful case? This is the case of Cameron Todd Willingham, a case that does not end with a sentence, but begins with an execution. 2 days before Christmas of 1991, winter in Corsicana, Texas, was stained by a tragedy that would chill the blood of the small community. A voracious, relentless fire devoured a modest one-story wooden house. Living there were Cameron Todd Willingham, his young wife, Stacy Kuykendall, and their 3 small daughters, whose laughter and games used to fill the spaces of that humble home. Cameron Todd Willingham, the father, managed to escape the flames. He exited the house with barely a scratch, a fact that, in the horror of the situation, began to plant the first seeds of suspicion in the minds of investigators and neighbors. How was it possible for a man to come out unscathed from an inferno that consumed everything in its path? At that fateful moment, Stacy Kuykendall, only 22 years old, was not at home. The young mother had gone out for a task that reflected the family's harsh economic reality. She was buying gifts at a charity store. They had no money for the holidays, and Stacy was desperately looking for a way to bring a bit of Christmas joy to her little ones. An absence that would save her from the flames, but condemn her to a life of immeasurable pain. Inside the house, trapped by thick smoke and devouring flames, the 3 girls perished. Amber, only 2 years old, and the twins, Carmen and Cameron, barely 1 year old, died from smoke inhalation, their tiny lives extinguished before they could even understand the world around them. The innocence of their age collided with the brutality of fire, leaving a void that no explanation or sentence could ever fill. The fire in Corsicana was not just an accidental tragedy, it soon became the epicenter of a homicide investigation. The speed and intensity of the fire, combined with Willingham's apparent lack of injury, led authorities to suspect that the fire had been intentional and that he was responsible. The loss of his daughters, the pain of a ruined Christmas, and the suspicion that the father himself was the killer would create a case that, years later, would still resonate as one of the most controversial in the history of the death penalty in Texas. The image of 3 little girls, engulfed in the smoke and flames of what was supposed to be their safe home, would become the driving force behind a relentless pursuit of justice, or what was interpreted as such. The fire chief of Corsicana, Douglas Fogg, and Fire Inspector Manuel Vasquez examined the site with basic tools. Their conclusion: the fire was deliberately set. They detected irregular burn patterns on the floor and walls, known as V marks, traditionally interpreted as signs of accelerants. They also noted that some areas of the floor appeared to be more deeply burned, which they considered a sign that flammable liquid had been used. No faulty electrical devices or obvious accidental causes were found. According to them, someone had started the fire, intentionally. Cameron Todd Willingham was arrested days later. Born in 1968, Cameron grew up in Texas, with a childhood marked by the absence of his biological mother and a difficult relationship with his stepmother. From a young age, he showed rebelliousness. He committed petty thefts, had problems with authority, and in his teenage years was arrested for vandalism. In his youth, he met Stacy Kuykendall. They had a tumultuous relationship. Fights, separations, reconciliations. But they got married and started a family. Cameron worked occasionally in odd jobs, had skull tattoos, listened to heavy metal. He wasn't the ideal father figure many expect to see, but there were no records of domestic violence or abuse toward his daughters. In an emotional, fictitious reconstruction based on general accounts we can find. A neighbor, years later, recalled seeing Cameron pushing a double stroller down the street. All 3 of them were always there, wrapped in blankets. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a tired dad. In the eyes of the Texas judicial system, Cameron was the perfect candidate to fit the profile of a killer. His lifestyle, his tattoos, his taste for metal music, his minor criminal history, and the general perception that he didn't react like a father should react made him a target of suspicion. In a small and conservative community like Corsicana, a man who didn't appear devastated in public, who didn't cry in front of the cameras, and who had a record, was immediately an uncomfortable figure, even before a formal accusation was made. What happened next was as swift as it was unsettling. The fire scene analysis, based on methods that are now considered outdated, became the fundamental basis of the accusation. The prosecutor presented the forensic reports as irrefutable evidence of an intentional fire, citing floor marks, so-called acceleration points, and patterns that were then interpreted as clear signs of flammable liquid use. Even though no fuel residue was found, neither in the house nor on Willingham's clothing, the firefighter's report was treated as the final word. There was no independent review, no doubts admitted, just a one-way path, from tragedy to punishment. The trial was brief, forceful, and deeply emotionally charged. The prosecution portrayed Cameron as a cold, indifferent man who preferred to go on with his life without the responsibilities of fatherhood. They used his lifestyle as a weapon. His love of Iron Maiden was presented as indirect proof of a dark mindset. His tattoos were mentioned as if they were proof of character, not personal aesthetics. Even the fact that he didn't break down during the funeral was highlighted as a sign of insensitivity. But the most powerful piece of evidence against him didn't come from the firefighters or the prosecutors. It came from another inmate. Johnny Webb, a man who shared a cell with Willingham, claimed that Cameron had confessed to the crime. There was no recording, no physical evidence, no third-party confirmation, just his word. Years later, Webb would admit he lied under pressure and that the prosecutor had promised him legal and financial benefits in exchange for his testimony. But at that time, in that trial, his version was taken as a revelation, and that was enough. The confession of James Chance Webb, years after Cameron Todd Willingham had been executed in Texas, echoes like a scream into the void, an indelible stain on the record of the American justice system. His words, "I didn't want to see Willingham sent to death row and die for something I knew very well was a lie. I lied about him because I was forced by John Jackson," are not just a revelation. They are a direct accusation against a system that prioritized conviction over truth with devastating consequences. Webb, in an interview with the Marshall Project, an organization that actively fights against the death penalty and exposes the failures of the judicial system, unveiled the harsh reality of his collaboration. "I gave in to the pressure, something I should not have done. In the end, they told me, either you serve life in prison or you testify." This admission not only reveals the coercion he was subjected to, but also exposes the questionable tactics used by the prosecution to secure a death sentence. John Jackson, the prosecutor in the case, appears to have been the central figure in this manipulation, exerting immense pressure on a vulnerable witness to obtain the desired testimony, regardless of its truthfulness. The most alarming aspect of this confession is the revelation that Willingham's defense was never informed of the agreement between the prosecution and the witness. This deliberate omission is not a simple oversight. It is a flagrant violation of due process rights. Information about such an agreement is crucial for the defense, as it allows them to question the credibility of the witness and expose possible ulterior motives for their testimony. By hiding this deal, Willingham was deprived of a fair and effective defense, a fundamental pillar of any respectable justice system. The case of Cameron Todd Willingham is a grim reminder of the inherent dangers of the death penalty and the irreversible consequences of a flawed judicial system. His story, marked by the accusation of having set fire to his own house in 1991, resulting in the death of his 3 little daughters, was always surrounded by controversy. Despite growing doubts about the forensic science used to prove the cause of the fire, and despite repeated appeals and voices crying out for a review, Willingham was executed in 2004. Webb's confession now casts an even darker light on this tragic case. It not only suggests that an innocent man may have been executed, but also exposes how the ambition for a death sentence can lead to the manipulation of evidence and testimonies. The pressure on witnesses, the concealment of vital information, and the possible negligence in reviewing scientific evidence are systemic failures that cry out for urgent reform. This testimony reopens the debate about the fallibility of the death penalty and the need for extreme scrutiny at every stage of the judicial process, especially when lives are at stake. Because in the darkness of death row, the echo of a lie can silence the truth forever. The defense, for its part, barely had tools. They didn't have expert witnesses who could refute the firefighters' reports. They lacked resources to challenge the scientific validity of the analysis. And they also failed to convince the jury that, even if Cameron was not a model of virtue, that didn't make him a murderer. In barely 3 days of deliberation, Cameron Todd Willingham was found guilty of triple homicide and intentional arson. The sentence, death. After the verdict, he was sent to death row in Huntsville prison, where he would spend more than a decade. During those years, Cameron always maintained his innocence. He wrote letters, requested a review of his case, and denied any responsibility in the death of his daughters. As time passed, his figure faded from public interest, except for brief mentions in the local press. His execution was scheduled for February 17, 2004. That day, Cameron was taken to the execution chamber. He was offered the possibility to confess and receive a suspension or commutation of sentence. He refused. His last words, addressed to his ex-wife, with whom he had a tense and painful relationship, were full of anger, frustration, and despair. He said he hoped that those who accused him unjustly would carry the weight of their conscience. Minutes later, he was executed by lethal injection, the official cause of death. Justice served. But that verdict, that certainty, would begin to crumble faster than authorities expected. The penalty phase in a homicide trial is perhaps the most decisive. The moment when it is determined whether a life will be spared or extinguished by the hand of the state. In the trial of Cameron Todd Willingham, this stage became a stage for fierce accusations and experts whose testimony, years later, would prove deeply problematic, sowing even more doubt about the justice of his death sentence. During this crucial period, a prosecutor, with a conviction bordering on theatrical, directed the jury's attention to Willingham's tattoos. Specifically, he focused on a tattoo of a skull and a snake, an image that, according to his rhetoric, fit the profile of a sociopath. In a courtroom where visual impressions and pseudoscientific theories could carry disproportionate weight, this assertion sought to cement the image of Willingham not only as a murderer, but as an embodiment of evil. To reinforce this theory, the prosecutor presented 2 medical experts who supposedly confirmed Willingham's dangerous nature. The first of these experts was a psychologist. However, his credibility in the field of sociopathic behavior was, at best, questionable. He had not published any relevant research in the field, and his only credential was a master's degree in marital and family affairs, a field of study far removed from forensic psychiatry or specialized criminology. This expert was asked to interpret elements that, for any rational mind, lacked clinical relevance for a sociopathy diagnosis. He was shown a poster of the heavy metal band Iron Maiden that Willingham owned. The image, a fist striking a skull, was presented by the psychologist as irrefutable evidence. It meant violence and death, he declared, in a simplistic and alarmist interpretation. Even more implausible was his analysis of a Led Zeppelin poster showing a fallen angel. According to him, this image was often an indicator of cultural type activities, a vague and baseless assertion that only served to weave a narrative of darkness around Willingham. The jury, without the benefit of a deeper understanding of forensic psychology, may have taken these interpretations as solid evidence of the accused's dangerousness. But the most chilling testimony came from the other medical expert, psychiatrist James Grigson. Known by the chilling nickname Dr. Death, Grigson had earned his infamous reputation for his repeated testimony as an expert witness in murder trials across the state of Texas, where he almost invariably recommended the death penalty. In Willingham's case, Grigson did not hesitate to state that a man with the defendant's criminal history was an extremely severe sociopath, and, more crucially, that he was incurable. His testimony not only sealed Willingham's fate in the eyes of the jury, but eliminated any hope of rehabilitation or life in prison. The shadow of controversy followed Grigson to the end of his days. Before his death, he was expelled by the American Psychiatric Association, APA, and the Texas Society of Psychiatric Physicians for unethical conduct. The APA was explicit in its reasons. Grigson had violated the organization's code of ethics by rendering a psychiatric diagnosis without first examining the individuals in question, and for stating, while testifying in court as an expert witness, that he could predict with 100% certainty that the individuals would commit future acts of violence. This detail is crucial. Grigson, Dr. Death, who with his authority and the weight of his title had sent countless men to death row, including Willingham, based his diagnoses on superficial or non-existent evaluations, and boasted a predictive certainty that psychiatric science categorically rejects. A psychiatrist's professional ethics forbid diagnosing without a direct examination, and even more so, predicting future behavior with 100% certainty. The testimony of Grigson and the psychologist with questionable credentials was not just another piece in the puzzle of Willingham's trial. It was a determining factor in the penalty phase. The manipulation of science and the presentation of experts with clear agendas, along with the later confession of James Chance Webb, paint a bleak picture of a justice system that, in its eagerness to convict, dangerously strayed from the path of justice and truth. The story of Cameron Todd Willingham and the dubious science that helped condemn him remains a grim reminder of the dangers of the death penalty and the fragility of truth in a courtroom. Less than a year after the execution, a renowned chemist named Gerald Hurst, an expert in fire analysis, received the case documents. What he found chilled him to the bone. According to Hurst, none of the supposed signs of arson were scientifically valid. The marks on the floor, the V-shapes on the walls, the burn patterns, all could be easily explained by the phenomenon known as flashover, an event in which a fire, after reaching a certain temperature, consumes the oxygen in the environment and spreads violently in all directions. What had previously been interpreted as evidence of multiple points of origin or the use of accelerants was, in fact, the natural behavior of fire in an enclosed space. Hurst's report was forceful. He delivered it to the defense team and the Texas authorities weeks before the execution. However, there was no response. No review, no extension, no emergency appeal. The clock kept ticking, and Cameron was executed without the new findings being reviewed. After the execution, Hurst's report began to circulate among academics, journalists, and human rights advocates. The scientific community began to review the case carefully. What they found was even more alarming. The methods used by the Corsicana firefighters in 1991 were representative of a widespread forensic practice throughout the United States. In other words, not only could Cameron have been the victim of an error, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of cases where the same flawed criteria had been applied. As the case gained attention outside Texas, investigative journalists began to connect dots that had once seemed unrelated. One of them was the renowned writer David Grann, who, after an extensive investigation, published in 2009 an article in The New Yorker titled "Trial by Fire." The report was devastating. With prose as sharp as it was meticulous, Grann exposed every weak point in the case: the absence of physical evidence, the erroneous forensic science, the manipulated testimony from the inmate, and, above all, the system's indifference to the possibility of error. Grann didn't just present the case as a legal tragedy, but as a moral dilemma. His article was read by millions of people, debated in universities, cited in the US Congress, and quickly became one of the most influential journalistic documents on the death penalty in the country's modern history. Through his investigation, Willingham's face went from that of a presumed monster to representing all those who might have been unjustly executed. What made Grann's article especially powerful was its ability to show the gray areas. It didn't present Willingham as a saint or as an absolute victim. It showed his humanity. He was a man with flaws, with a complex past, yes, but also with reasonable doubts against him. The story ceased to be only about justice or injustice and became a reflection on what it means to punish without being absolutely sure. And that's where the second phase of the scandal began: the state's response. The then governor of Texas, Rick Perry, was one of the most harshly criticized figures after the article's publication and the circulation of Hurst's report. It was revealed that the scientific review document had reached his hands before the execution and that he decided not to intervene. When an independent forensic commission was created to analyze the case and determine whether the state had executed an innocent man, Perry made a decision that many saw as an attempt to cover up. He abruptly replaced several commission members just before they began deliberations. The act was seen as a clear attempt to block the case's review. Media pressure increased. Human rights organizations, academics, and citizens demanded an official review of the case file. But the Texas judicial system remained firm. The sentence was never overturned. The execution record was never amended. No error was ever acknowledged. To this day, Cameron Todd Willingham is still officially listed as a convicted criminal executed for murdering his 3 daughters. The most tragic part of this case is not just the judicial failure, but what came afterward. The institutional denial of the possibility of being wrong. The justice machine operating like a runaway train where correcting a mistake is more costly than sustaining a lie. And Willingham's execution didn't happen in the 19th century. It wasn't a spontaneous lynching in a lawless town. It was the result of a formal legal process in the 21st century, with courts, lawyers, juries, and scientists. And still, according to numerous experts, the state killed an innocent man. What follows is even more painful. When examining the pattern of the Willingham case, other convictions came under scrutiny. Similar cases with similar forensic methods began to raise suspicions. In many of them, the convicted were already dead. There was no more justice to be applied, only memory and collective guilt. Within the U.S. legal system, one of its fundamental pillars is the concept of certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. But the Willingham case demonstrated that reasonable doubt doesn't always have space where it should. When emotional narratives, media pressure, and social prejudices prevail, that doubt disintegrates. It becomes noise, an obstacle, something to be ignored so that the machinery can operate without friction. And in this case, that machinery did not stop until a lethal injection did its job. At the heart of the case lies the question many prefer to avoid. If we can execute someone with so much evidence of error, how many others have been unjustly executed without our knowing? Cameron's case became visible because it sparked debate, reports, articles, public controversy. But what about those who died in silence? How many names have been lost under the weight of judicial bureaucracy? How many mistakes had no David Grant to expose them? Over time, even members of Cameron's family began to speak out more forcefully. His stepmother, his cousin, former friends, all publicly testified that they always believed in his innocence. They pointed out that there was never real evidence, only assumptions, and a narrative built around who he was. They explained that his letters from prison were gloomy, yes, but also lucid, that he spoke more about the pain of losing his daughters than about the judicial process, that he did not show hatred, but disbelief. In one of his last letters, Willingham wrote, "I don't want to be remembered as the monster they said I was. I want someone someday to say out loud that I didn't do it. Not to save me, but so that my daughters aren't remembered as the daughters of a murderer. Let them be remembered for what they were. Girls, just girls." Willingham's figure eventually became a kind of specter within the national debate over the death penalty. For some, he was still a murderer who manipulated public compassion from his cell. For others, he was the clearest face of irreversible error. The truth is that, in the public discussion, his case was no longer just about him, but about everyone, about the system, about the limits of justice, about what the word irrevocable really means. The case also caused deep divisions among the victims' families. Cameron's ex-wife, Stacey Kuykendall, remained firm for years in her stance that he was guilty. She even publicly declared that he had confessed the crime to her in a private conversation. However, her testimony was contradictory. In earlier interviews, she had said otherwise. Shifts in versions, conflicting statements, and accumulated emotions formed a dense fog that never cleared. To this day, Stacey maintains that Cameron started the fire, but her declaration, like many other pieces of the case, is not free from controversy. Forensic psychologists, real and fictional, have analyzed for years the emotional profile of Willingham and those around him. In a hypothetical reconstruction, an expert might conclude the following. A person who has lost his 3 daughters in an accident he himself caused intentionally would be expected to be erratic, evasive, even resigned. But Willingham did not show that. What he showed was a constant, focused, and obsessive defense to clear his name. That, in itself, does not absolve him. but it does distance him from the most common profiles of filicide. At the same time, if the case were examined from a broader legal perspective, the inevitable question would be, why wasn't the execution halted when reasonable doubts were raised by a serious scientific report? The most common and most unsettling answer is simple: because the system is not designed to admit errors once the machinery is in motion. In many US states, an appeal of a death sentence is not always based on whether the convicted is innocent, but on whether the process was technically correct. And that reveals a brutal paradox. Someone can be executed even when there are serious doubts about their guilt, as long as the legal procedure was followed to the letter. In Willingham's case, the procedure was followed. There was a trial, there was a jury, there were appeals. But what there wasn't was reliable science, nor a genuine review of the new evidence. And that, for many, is not justice. It is deadly bureaucracy. The cultural impact of the case was also significant. Films, documentaries, academic debates, and plays were inspired by the story. But beyond art and journalism, there were legislative consequences. Some states began to review old cases of fatal fires. Forensic practices were questioned. Commissions were established to review possible judicial errors. But the change, although real, was slow, and it did not bring the dead back. One of the most chilling elements of this story is that even today, many still deny the possibility of error. They argue that Willingham was guilty, that science doesn't change facts, that the jury saw him, heard him, and decided. But others, more and more, understand that it's not enough to have a conviction if the path to it was tainted. Because when it comes to death, the margin of error should be zero. The story of Cameron Todd Willingham does not end with his death. In many ways, it began right after. In the words of the scientists who defended him, in the articles that exhumed him from the shadows, in the activists who turned him into a symbol, and in the questions that remain unanswered. Perhaps that is why this case still hurts. Not just for the 3 girls who died, who should never have been taken from life. Not just for a trial that may have been wrong, but because the entire tragedy may have been doubled. Because maybe 4 lives were lost in that fire, and not 3. True justice is not just about punishing the guilty. It is also, and above all, about not punishing the innocent. And when someone is executed in the midst of doubts, that justice ceases to be blind and becomes deaf. In one of the last lines written by Willingham from prison, addressed to his cousin, there is a short, simple phrase that sums up his despair. If the truth is ever told, let it be for them. Let them not be remembered as the daughters of a killer, but as daughters who deserve justice. That justice, until now, has yet to arrive.